Chapter 4. What happened that night. The king was so dizzy from being knocked down that he barely knew what was happening until the Calormenes untied his wrists and put his arms straight down by his sides and set him with his back against an ash tree. Then they bound ropes around his ankles and knees and his waist and his chest and left him there. What worried him worst at the moment, for it is often the little things that are hardest to stand, was that his lip was bleeding where they had hit him, and he couldn't wipe the little trickle of blood that always seemed to tickle him. From where he was, he could still see the little stable on the top of the hill, and the ape sitting in front of it. He could just hear the ape's voice still going on, and every now and again some answer from the crowd, and he could not make out the words. "I wonder what they've done to Jewel," thought the king. Presently the crowd of beasts broke up and began going away in different directions. Some passed close to Tirian. They looked at him as if they were both frightened and sorry to see him tied up, but none of them spoke. Soon they had all gone, and there was silence in the wood. Then hours went past, and Tirian became very thirsty first, and then very hungry. As the afternoon dragged on and turned into evening, he became very cold too. His back was very sore. The sun went down, and it began to be twilight. When it was almost dark, Tirian heard a light pitter-patter of feet, and saw some small creatures coming toward him. The three on the left were mice, and there was a rabbit in the middle, and there were two moles. Both of these were carrying little bags on their backs, which gave them a curious look in the dark, so that at first he wondered what kind of beasts these were. Then in a moment, they were all standing up on their hind legs, laying their cool paws on his knees, and giving his knees snuffly animal kisses. Well, they could reach his knees, because Narnian talking beasts of that sort are bigger than the dumb beasts of the same kind in England. "Lord King, dear Lord King," said their shrill voices, "we are so sorry for you. We daren't untie you because Aslan might be angry with us, but we've brought you your supper." At once the first mouse climbed nimbly up until he was perched on the rope that bound Tirian's chest, and was wrinkling his blunt nose in front of Tirian's face. Then the second mouse climbed up and hung on just below the first mouse. And the other beasts stood on the ground and began handing things up. "Drink, sire, and then you'll find you are able to eat," said the topmost mouse. Tirian found the little wooden cup was being held to his lips. It was only the size of an egg cup, so that he hardly tasted the wine in it before it was empty. But then the mouse passed it down again, and the others refilled it and passed it back up again, and Tirian emptied it a second time. And in this way they went on till he had had quite a good drink, which was all the better for coming in little doses, for it is more thirst-quenching than one long draught. "Here is cheese, sire," said the first mouse, "but not very much, for fear it would make you too thirsty." And after the cheese, they fed him with some oat cakes and fresh butter, and then with some more wine. "Now hand up the water," said the first mouse, "and I'll wash the king's face. There is blood on it." Then Tirian felt something like a tiny sponge dabbing his face. It was most refreshing. "Little friends," said Tirian, "how can I thank you for all of this?" You needn't," said the little voices. "What else could we do? We don't want any other king. We're your people. If it was only the ape and the Calormenes who were against us, we would have fought till we were cut into pieces before we would let them tie you up. We would indeed, but we can't go against Aslan." "Do you think it is really Aslan?" asked the king. "Oh, yes, said the rabbit. "He came out of the stable last night. We all saw him." "What was he like?" said the king. "Oh, like a terrible great lion, to be sure," said one of the mice. "And you really think it is Aslan, who is killing wood nymphs and making you all slaves to the king of Calormen?" "Oh, that's bad, it is, isn't it?" said the second mouse. "It would be better if we had died before all this began, but there's no doubt about it. Everyone says it is Aslan's orders. And we have seen him. We didn't think Aslan would be like that. Why, we wanted him to come back to Narnia." "He seems to have come back very angry this time," said the first mouse. "We must all have done something dreadfully wrong without knowing it. He must be punishing us for something, but I do think we might be told what it was." "I suppose what we're doing now may be wrong," said the rabbit. "I don't care if it is," said one of the moles. "I'd do it again." But the others said, "Oh, hush," and "Do be careful." And then they all said, "We're sorry, dear king, but we must go back now. It would never do for us to be caught here." "Leave me at once, dear beasts," said Tirian. "I would not for all Narnia bring any of you into danger." "Good night, good night," said the beasts, rubbing their noses against his knees. "We will come back if we can." And they all pattered away, and the wood seemed darker and colder and lonelier than it had been before they came. The stars came out, and time went slowly on. Imagine how slowly. While the last king of Narnia stood stiff and sore and upright against the tree in his bonds. But at last, something happened. Far away there appeared to be a red light. Then it disappeared for a moment, came back again, bigger and stronger. Then he could see dark shapes going to and fro on this side of the light and carrying bundles and throwing them down. He knew now what he was looking at. It was a bonfire, newly lit, and people were throwing bundles of brushwood onto it. Presently it blazed up, and Tirian could see it was on the very top of the hill. He could see quite clearly the stable behind it, all lit up in the red glow, and a great crowd of beasts and men between the fire and himself. A small figure, hunched up beside the fire, must be the ape. It was saying something to the crowd, but he could not hear what. Then it went and bowed 3 times to the ground in front of the door by the stable. Then he got up and opened the door. And something on 4 legs, something that walked rather stiffly, came out of the stable and stood facing the crowd. A great wailing or howling went up so loud that Tirian could hear some of the words. "Aslan! Aslan! Aslan!" cried the beast. "Speak to us! Comfort us! Be angry with us no more!" From where Tirian was, he could not make out very clearly what the thing was. But he could see it was yellow and hairy. He had never seen the great lion. He had never seen a common lion, but couldn't be sure what he saw was not the real Aslan. He had not expected Aslan to look like that stiff thing which stood and said nothing, but how could one be sure? For a moment, horrible thoughts went through his mind. Then he remembered the nonsense about Tash and Aslan being the same, and he knew the whole thing must be a cheat. The ape put its head close to the yellow thing's head as if it were listening to something that was whispering to him. Then he turned and spoke to the crowd, and the crowd wailed again. Then the yellow thing turned clumsily round and walked, you might almost say waddled, back into the stable, and the ape shut the door behind it. After that the fire must have been put out, for the light vanished quite suddenly, and Tirian was once more alone in the cold and the darkness. He thought of other kings who had lived and died in Narnia in old times, and it seemed to him that none of them had ever been so unlucky as himself. He thought of his great-grandfather's great-grandfather, King Rilian, who had been stolen away by a witch when he was only a young prince, and kept hidden for years in the dark caves beneath the land of the northern giants. But then it had come all right in the end, for 2 mysterious children had suddenly appeared from the land beyond the world's end, and had rescued him so that he came home to Narnia and had a long and prosperous reign. "It's not like that with me," said Tirian to himself. Then he went further back and thought about Rilian's father, Caspian the Seafarer, whose wicked uncle King Myraz had tried to murder him, and how Caspian fled away into the woods and lived among the dwarfs. But that story, too, had all come right in the end. For Caspian for Caspian also had been helped by children. Only there were 4 of them this time, who had come from somewhere beyond the world and fought a great battle and set him on his father's throne. But it was all so long ago, said Tirion to himself. That sort of thing doesn't happen now. And then he remembered, for he had always been good at history when he was a boy, how those same 4 children who had helped Caspian had been in Narnia over 1,000 years before. And it was then they had done the most remarkable thing of all. For then they had defeated the terrible White Witch and ended the 100 years of winter, and after that they had reigned, all 4 of them together, at Cair Paravel, till they were no longer children but great kings and lovely queens, and their reign had been the golden age of Narnia. And Aslan had come into that story a lot. He had come into all the stories too, as Tirion now remembered. Aslan and children from another world, thought Tirion. They have always come when things were at their worst. Oh, if only they could do it now. And he called out, Aslan! Aslan! Aslan, come and help us now! But the darkness and the cold and the quietness went on just the same. Let me be killed, said the king. I ask nothing for myself, but please come and save all Narnia. And still, there was no change in the night or the wood. But there began to be a kind of change inside Tirion. Without knowing why, he began to feel a faint hope. And he felt somehow stronger. Oh, Aslan! Aslan! He whispered. If you will not come yourself, at least send the helpers from beyond the world. Or let me call them. Let my voice carry beyond the world. And then, hardly knowing what he was doing, he suddenly cried out with a great voice, Children! Children, friends of Narnia! Quick! Come to me! Across the worlds I call you! I, Tirion, King of Narnia, Lord of Cair Paravel, Emperor of the Lone Islands. And immediately he was plunged into a dream, if it was a dream, more vivid than he had ever had in his life. He seemed to be standing in a lighted room where 7 people sat round a table. It looked as if they had just finished their meal. 2 of these people were very old, an old man with a white beard and an old woman with wise, merry, and twinkling eyes. He who sat at the right hand of the old man was hardly full grown, certainly younger than Tirion himself. But his face already had the look of a king and warrior. And you could almost say the same of the other youth who sat at the right hand of the old woman. Facing Tirion across the table sat a fair-haired girl, younger than either of these, and on either side of her a boy and a girl who were younger still. They were all dressed in what seemed to Tirion the oddest kind of clothes. But he had no time to think about the details like that, for instantly the younger boy and both the girls started to their feet, and one of them gave a little scream. Then the old woman started and drew in her breath sharply. The old man must have made some sudden movement too, for the wine glass which stood at his right hand was swept off the table. Tirion could hear the tinkling noise as it broke on the floor. Then Tirion realized the people could see him. They were staring at him as if they saw a ghost. But he noticed that the king-like one who sat at the man's right hand never moved, though he turned pale, except that he clenched his hand very tight. And then he said, Speak! If you're not a phantom or a dream, you have a Narnian look about you, and we are the 7 friends of Narnia. Tirion was longing to speak, and he tried to cry out aloud that he was Tirion of Narnia in great need of help, but he found, as if I have sometimes found in dreams, that his voice made no noise at all. The one who had already spoken to him rose to his feet. Shadow, or spirit, or whatever you are, he said, fixing his eyes full upon Tirion, if you are from Narnia, I charge you in the name of Aslan. Speak to me. I am Peter, the High King. The room began to swim before Tyrion's eyes. He heard the voices of those 7 people all speaking at once, and all were getting fainter by every second. And they were saying things like, look, it's fading, it's melting away, it's vanishing. Next moment, he was wide awake. still tied to the tree, colder and stiffer than ever. The wood was full of pale, dreary light that comes before sunrise. He was soaking wet with dew. It was nearly morning. That waking was about the worst moment he'd ever had in his life. And that's the end of chapter 4. In this scene of the ministry of these small animals in kindness and mercy to Tirian, I can't help but think back from this last book to our first book, with Aslan and his body tied to the stone table, and the field mice that came up and gnawed away the ropes that bound him there. And in that moment of kind of beautiful symmetry, maybe, the mercy of these small creatures, so frightened and yet determined to do what little good they could, were left with the bitter sorrow of the king, the lowest point of his life, but maybe, just maybe, that glimmer of hope, that in his darkest hour he turns to Aslan himself, asking not for his own safety or his own rescue, but that Aslan would remember his people, he would remember his kingdom, and he would save them in our darkest moment, to call, to cry out in the name of the Lord, and to know no matter our circumstances, he knows us, and he hears us. And though the chapter ends the worst moment of Tirian's life, I gotta say, it's hard to read that moment where either in a dream or a vision or something supernatural, he is there in front of the friends of Narnia, and the High King Peter identifies himself, and I just can't read it without feeling a little something, a little twinge up my back, to know that something powerful is about to happen. Tirian has called in the name of Aslan, and I believe he is being answered. And now we just need to see what's going to happen next.